And just to throw even more complexity into this equation, CPT assigns 4 different attributes to each specific cognitive function. These attributes go as follows. Orientation. This is simple enough. Your dominant function will be one orientation, your oppositional function will be the opposite orientation. So INFJ, introverted intuition, opposite function, opposite end of the spectrum, would be extrovert sensing. Same with your 2 auxiliaries. Convergent auxiliary, in my case, would be introverted thinking, and thus the opposite end of the spectrum, in this regard, would be extroverted feeling, because it manifests the opposite orientation as well as the opposite nature. Magnitude. This is the degree to which a function is used in relation to its opposite. If I was employing a high magnitude of introverted intuition, as I often do, I would be gazing plethorically across a very wide scope of my internal landscape at the expense of details. Therefore, I'll be getting a tremendously large sense of the big picture, but at the expense of locking into specific details. However, magnitude can fluctuate, and therefore I can gaze predominantly at a wide area, a wide scope of my brain, and then use introverted sensing, the oppositional function of the opposite orientation, to engage with the details and actually render what I'm thinking, what I'm perceiving, more tangible. Consciousness. This again is fairly self-explanatory. One function is going to be more conscious than another one, but that doesn't mean the conscious has less magnitude, and it doesn't mean it has a different orientation. All of these things are mutually exclusive variables. So the dominant function is almost always going to be highly conscious, but when you rotate on your axis and engage your oppositional function as your alternate dominant, what was previously the dominant function will become more unconscious, because you cannot have one end of the spectrum conscious at the exact same time as the other end of the spectrum. And as such, often the 2 dominant functions, the dominant function and the convergent auxiliary, will be more conscious, whereas the divergent functions, for as long as you're engaging your primary ego complex, will be more unconscious. And finally, we have the attitudes. The attitudes are one of the defining characteristics of what separates CPT from other systems. We have convergence and divergence. My introverted intuition, my introverted thinking as an INFJ are convergent, therefore I'm taking active responsibility for them. I'm constantly monitoring them. They are the agenda of my ego complex. These functions are the functions I like to play around with. I don't use them primarily as authority functions, but rather I use them in order to play. I use them in order to perceive new information, and sometimes with my introverted intuition, introverted thinking cogitations can take an entirely devil's advocate approach to any given logic, because logic is not my authority, therefore I seek new patterns for the sake of novelty. And my extrovert feeling authority compels me to do right by other people, and thus use my introvert thinking cogitation in order to do right by others, and thus there is always going to be a logical sense of authority, because people require logic, they require consistency. But the default agenda of the INFJ's introvert thinking is not divergent, and therefore it is not instilling consequence, it is not abiding by rules, it is creating the INFJ's own rules. I find my own ways of doing things. I use introvert thinking and introverted intuition in order to manifest my individuality, in order to express myself in a creative manner. Divergent functions are the exact opposite. Therefore, my divergent functions, extrovert sensing and extrovert feeling, are more negativistic. They instill within me a sense of consequence. They anchor me into reality, and they keep my convergent functions, the creativity of those 2 functions, in check. Without my extrovert sensing and extrovert feeling, I would just be going on tangents within my brain constantly. I'd be looking at new ways of perceiving internally stored abstract information, but would not be beholden to anything or anybody else. It is my extrovert sensing divergent auxiliary to my oppositional function, extrovert sensing, that compels me to come up with new ways of doing things in order to serve other people, to come up with new ideas in order to enhance my concrete social experience. And it is my divergent functions that hold me accountable to reality. Hello all, so we've come now to the end of this series breaking down the fundamentals behind CPT. If you feel like I've left anything out, definitely let me know what that is down below in the comments, and I'll try and either address it then and there or make a separate video on the topic. And furthermore, definitely check out the CPT ebook, because with the exception of the 4 CPT attributes, which are relatively new by comparison, this does go into a lot more depth into all of these various factors I've explored within this series. And as CPT continues to expand and evolve and find even more pathways between cognitive function interactions, whether intrapersonal or interpersonal, I'll be sure to be making more videos like this anyway. And so on that note, I hope you all have a great weekend, and I'll be seeing you next Saturday.